Welcome to the Celebration of You. I'm your host, Holly Dowling. I'm thrilled to share with you incredible people from all over the world who are living and leading extraordinary lives. From overcoming immense adversity to discovering the secret sauce to leading with courage and grace. Their stories are going to bring you hope and inspiration. Now, let the stories begin. Welcome, everybody. Delighted and beyond thrilled to have you join me today for this incredible human being that I've been blessed to meet. And so I just have to fess up and tell you, everyone that listens knows that I'm passionate about a few things in my life. And one of those is being open to serendipitous moments. You just never know who you may meet, but when you're open and willing, the greatest gifts can come to you. So the amazing man you're about to meet, and I'm not even going to tell you what's about to blow your mind, but we met on an airplane not too long ago. And we're both the people that don't actually like to talk. We like to put our headsets on and just keep to ourselves and watch movies. So on that note, I'm prepping you and dangling the carrot. I want to pause before I go into this interview and thank every single person out there around the world that is listening to this show. For those of you that have been listening since the beginning, this has been a mission on my heart because I believe there's so many amazing people around the world that are living extraordinary lives for either the reason of going through adversity and overcoming it, or they're choosing to do something with their life to make a difference for others. So that's why I do this. But I had no idea till just in the last few weeks, the magnitude of people, and I want to do a shout out to all of you and all of the people calling that are listening to this from around the world. So here we go. I was a little bit in tears when I saw this because, again, no idea. We just do the show. So I'm just going to give you all a huge gratitude, huge shout out. Love hearing from you. Love knowing what's impacting you, what's changing your life by hearing a story of hope. So here we go. Every state in the United States, Canada, United Kingdom, Germany, Poland, Mexico, Australia, France, Spain, Netherlands, South Africa, Brazil, Chile, Russian Federation, Belgium, Italy, Egypt, Switzerland, Pakistan, Ireland, the Philippines, Costa Rica, Finland, Hungary, Czech Republic, Turkey, Indonesia, Lebanon, Colombia, Argentina, Greece, Sweden, India, Norway, Singapore, Bulgaria, Malaysia, Vietnam, Saudi Arabia, Barbados, Thailand, the Virgin Islands, Bosnia, Algeria, Morocco, and Albania. I'm blown away, and I want to say thank you to all of you because it doesn't matter where we live, what language we speak, how old we are, or what gender we are. We are all human beings on this earth, and I believe we're all craving to do more and live to our soul's highest calling and give back. And that, to me, my friends, is the essence of the person you're about to meet. I would like to welcome this amazing gift that I met on a plane. By name, it is Stephen Pressman. So welcome, Stephen.
It's an honor, a true honor.
Well, you just got to hear, I'm blown away too, at all of the countries, people that are listening to the show. And I think that your story, the moment I met you and we talked, and what you've chosen to do with your life, truly touched my heart. And so I'm going to let you tell the story, but I just have to brag on you for a minute. And that is this amazing, brilliant gentleman who I met on a plane, who's been a journalist for magazines, newspapers, from the East Coast, DC, New York, all the way to the West Coast for years. And I'm not even going to tell you how many years. Fell into a passion of discovering a story that touched his heart so much that he said the world needs to hear this. And I am sitting here looking at the book. I've already watched the movie. And so, Stephen, without further ado, will you tell us all about this passion that you brought to life?
Thank you, Holly. And let me tell you, I was impressed by that list of countries. That's a lot. That covers a lot of the globe. So wonderful honors to you for sharing these inspiring moments with so many people around the globe.
Thank you.
I was very fortunate. Some years ago, I live in San Francisco, and 16 or 17 years ago, I met a remarkable woman named Liz Purley. Liz and I got to know each other, and even more remarkably for me, about a year after we met, Liz and I got married. And somewhere in that time, shortly before or after we got married, she said that she wanted to share something with me. And Liz went upstairs to a little office that she kept in our home in San Francisco and opened up just a plain ordinary file drawer and pulled out a folder and handed me this folder. And I looked inside the folder, and there was a stack of typewritten pages on old-fashioned onion skin paper. Now, I'll bet a lot of folks who are listening will have, at least people who are under a certain age, will have no idea what onion skin paper is.
I do.
Right? I had a feeling you did, Holly. Yeah. And I'm certainly old enough to know what onion skin paper is. And it's just old-fashioned typing paper that people used to use a long time ago, back in the days of mimeographs and carbon paper and things like that. Liz handed me the stack of pages, and I started reading it. And what I was reading was a story that Liz's grandmother, a woman named Eleanor Krauss, had typed out on that paper decades before. And it told the story of how Eleanor Krauss, that was Liz's grandmother's name, of how Eleanor Krauss and her husband Gil, who was a lawyer in Philadelphia in the 1930s, had gone to Vienna, Austria in the spring of 1939 in order to rescue a group of Jewish children and bring them back to the United States just on the eve of the Holocaust. Well, I read this account, and it was about 100 pages of a sort of a typed manuscript. And I looked at Liz and I said, "What am I reading? Is this a novel that your grandmother wrote?" By the time I met Liz, both of her grandparents had been deceased for some years, so I didn't know them, but she did. And she said, "No, this is something my grandparents did. Nobody really knows about this story. Nobody outside of the family knows anything about it, but this is what they did." And at that moment, I thought, wow, why doesn't the world know about this story? And Liz basically said, well, because my grandparents never talked about it. Never talked about it with their friends, barely even talked about it with their family. But fortunately, Eleanor Krauss had left behind this stack of onion skin pages with that story. And that's when I knew that somehow or another, at some point in my life, I would need to make an effort to tell this story. Well, I was busy working, and we were raising a couple of young kids at the time, and other things were going on in our lives, and I sort of set those pages down. But I went back to it 6 or 7 years later, because I never forgot the incredible power of that story, which initially I didn't even believe was true. And I started to look into it, and I started to do a little bit of my own historical research. And again, I discovered that nobody knew this story. We started talking to people at the United States Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. They had not heard this story.
Really?
They did not.
No one knew this? Not a soul knew this.
Nobody knew this story.
Wow.
And all my years of being a journalist, if they taught me nothing else, it was to recognize when a nice, pretty good story lands in my lap. And here was the opportunity to tell a story that was a very powerful story. And rather than write it out as a book or a magazine piece, I was looking to do something a little different in my own life. And I decided that I would make an effort at turning this incredible story about this amazing couple into a documentary film. And I spent a couple of years doing more research, interviewing people. Lo and behold, I was able to locate 10 or 12 of the rescued children. There were 50 children that Gil and Eleanor Krauss had rescued from Vienna, Austria, and brought with them
50.
back to the United States. 50.
Yeah, 50. I want people to hear that. 50 children that they rescued, and no one knew about this.
No one knew about this. And I knew I had this unbelievable story to share with the world. And it was a true, I don't use this word lightly because I have to admit, and maybe I shouldn't be confessing this to you, but I'm not the most sort of spiritual person in the world, but it was truly a blessing for me to share the story of my wife's grandparents and this amazing thing that they had done, and after which they had the humility for the rest of their lives not to talk about it, not to brag about it. They simply went on with their lives. And all these years later, some 70 or 75 years after the fact, I was able to shine a well-deserved spotlight on this unbelievable couple. And just one other little fact that is important for people to keep in mind when we think about something as horribly tragic as the Holocaust and the millions of lives that were lost and the hundreds of thousands of lives that might have been saved. The 50 children that Gil and Eleanor brought with them to the United States turned out to be the largest single group of what are known as unaccompanied children. That is, children that were sent off by their parents. The 50 were the largest single group of those unaccompanied children who were allowed into our country, into the United States, during the entirety of the Holocaust. That's a sad and a depressing number, and yet this couple managed to do what so many other people were unable to do during a time of immense horror, indescribable tragedy. They went literally into the heart of darkness, into Nazi Germany, a Jewish couple from Philadelphia, and brought 50 children back with them to the United States. You know, it's still this goes back a few years for me, and I have to say I still get sort of goosebumps when I think about what they did and the sacrifices that they made, leaving behind their own 2 children and the safety of their lives in Philadelphia to do what they did. And for me, it was just an immense privilege to first make the film, which wound up on HBO and has shown around the world, and then to write a book about this same topic. It was beyond doubt the most fulfilling and satisfying thing I've ever done in my professional career as a journalist and as a storyteller.
And when you think about all the stories that you have been touched by and had the privilege, right, to share over all these years of being a journalist, and this story is sitting in your room upstairs in a drawer from your wife, right? And this story that the visual of knowing that on that paper was a story that was such a hidden gem that no one knew. I have to ask you, and I want people, I don't want to give away everything in the film, because the film and the book, it's 50 Children. That is the name of it. And I want people to go get it, because I couldn't wait. When we met on the plane, I just told Steve, I go, as soon as I got home, within 36 hours, my husband, Steve, and I watched it, because I was like, I have to see this. I've always been passionate about true stories. And when we get to see documentaries of real life, people that are doing things in our world. But I have to ask you, when you did this and you learned about this journey that they took, I mean, thinking back on the time and the era that they were doing this in, right? In such a dark time. And we didn't have all of this access to internet and all these other ways that we can access people and things. I mean, I want people to realize this is in the times when we had nothing for communication, right? When the part that got me is that when you set out to find some of these children that were part of the 50 children, tell us about some of the stories, Steve, that what you realized through their eyes of what these parents had done and these people.
That's a great question, Holly, and probably the most memorable part of this whole experience for me was getting to know several of these rescued children. I still call them children because they were always the 50 children. By the time I got to them, they were children in their 70s and 80s. And now, when I said a moment ago that nobody knew about this story, obviously, if you were one of those 50 children, you knew that you had been saved. You knew that somebody had come to get you, and you knew that somebody had brought you to this strange place, the United States, leaving behind your parents and your family back home in Vienna. But none of those children knew who Gil and Eleanor Krauss were. None of those children knew what the Krausses had to go through themselves to carry this off. All they knew was that knew was that they had been brought to safety. And so for me, one of the most memorable and meaningful parts of this whole experience in telling the story was to be able to fill in the gaps for those children who, for decades, grew up not knowing who these people were, not knowing anything at all about this couple that had saved them. And here I was calling them out of the blue, a total stranger, telling them I was making this film. And, and some of them naturally were maybe a little skeptical. And then I would say, oh, by the way, I'm married to one of the grandchildren of Gil and Eleanor Krauss. And I'll tell you, if there was ever an icebreaker, if there was ever a line that got them to open up to me, that was it. And once that relationship was established with so many of these rescued children, I got to know them, I got to know their families, and it was just such a wonderful experience to be able to become part of their lives and to be in a position to share with them information about their own past. Because it turns out, through the research I did, I started finding records in places like Berlin and Vienna, old archives of questionnaires and documents that had to be filled out by the Krausses that told the history of these families whose children had been saved. And I was able to share that with these families. And to this day, and now I'm talking some years after I've made this film, because I made it a few years ago, I still stay in touch with either them. Some of them have since passed away as they've gotten older, but I'm still in touch with their families, with their children, with their grandchildren. Some of them now have great grandchildren.
Wow.
And talk about a deep ongoing impact. I don't take the credit for what the Krausses did. I was just in a wonderful opportunity to be able to bring to light what they did, and to allow them, all these years later, to grab a little of that spotlight that I think they so richly deserve. And again, that's just been such a wonderful part of all this. And you mentioned at the outset, just me stumbling across this story in that file drawer. All these years later, I like to think of this as a story that really was kind of hiding pretty much in plain sight.
Yes. Yeah.
Sitting in a file drawer all along. All I had to do was go in there and read it, and the story pretty much told itself. And it was such a pleasure.
Well, it was like, I'm looking at this from the lens of, it was like that story was being saved for you to be the one to bring it to life because of you being a journalist and understanding the power of stories. And yet it was such a close to home. This is your wife's grandparents, right? So on top of this, it's not like you were at the library and just came across a file, right? It's like there's all these connections and all of these things about it. The part that's fascinating to me that I would love to know, and I have no idea what your answer is going to be, but so I know that you shared with me it took about 3 years to get this movie done. Is that right?
Yeah, a couple of years, and then once I started with working with HBO, another 8 or 9 months of finishing it up with them. So yeah, nearly 3 years.
Yeah, and I remember when you were telling me that, I'm like, okay, so it got to the film festivals, but you didn't even have to try to go sell your film. HBO nabbed it up. It was like, wow, this was like, we have to have this. I would love to know, Steve, once this film went and the book went, what was the, what's the word I'm looking for? What was it like to hear from people that have randomly seen this, heard it, read it, and were touched by it? I know you had to have heard from other people around the world that once they saw this movie, there was a connection that maybe, I don't know, however their life was touched by it. I'd love to hear those.
Oh, I sure did. Couple of things come to mind, Holly. First of all, not too surprisingly, I wasn't able to find all of the 50 children. Particularly some of the women were difficult to find because I had a list of the names of all the 50, but names change over the years and people get lost or what have you. So there were a few people who somehow or another heard about the film or read the book and who were part of this story and got in touch with me. So I was able to learn more about them. But there's one story in particular that I will never forget as long as I live, that just still resonates so deeply with me. Not with the film, but when I wrote the book, there's a chapter, there's sort of an epilogue chapter at the end of the book that just gives a brief description, really a paragraph or two, for just about all of the 50 children, or at least almost all of the children for whom I had a little bit of information. And there was one guy who I knew had passed away, but I found a little information about him. He had lived in Chicago. He had been not quite adopted, but taken in by a foster family in Chicago, and his name had changed. And I never found out anything much more about him other than a little bit of information. Well, a few months after my book came out, I got an email from a woman in Chicago who said she was reading my book, and she's looking at the list of names at the end of the book, and she realizes that one of the paragraphs that she's reading was that of her late husband.
Really?
And that she, and I'm taking her at her word for this, Holly. She has no reason to make this up.
Right.
That she had never known, because he had never told her about the circumstances surrounding how he came to be a refugee from Nazi Germany, and how he had come to safety in the United States. All he had told her was that as a child, his parents had figured some way to get him to safety. She knew nothing of the story. She had never heard of Gil or Eleanor Krauss. She saw her husband's name in my book, and it filled in all of the gaps for her that her husband, for completely understandable reasons, had decided were too painful to share even with his wife. And I when I heard that, I thought, all right, if I don't do anything else for the rest of my days, this was worth it, to be able to tell a story and make those connections and allow people to, in effect, find their own closure for their own loved ones, and the risks that their own family members had gone through. And there were other moments like that, but boy, that particular one was about as dramatic as it got for me. And again, I'll never forget. And I've stayed in touch with her. She had her own amazing story. But it's connections like that really added so much to the emotional intensity of being able to tell the story of Gil and Eleanor Krauss and the 50 children that they saved from Adolf Hitler.
And I'm sitting here, Steve, with tear rolling down my face, because just to know, right, like that the impact of bringing that story to life, and a woman sitting in Chicago got closure to the missing pieces of her husband's life. I mean, she could now share this with her children, right? Like, I mean, there's family history. And little did you know the ripple effect that could impact the world and so many human beings. Oh, my eyes are closed, and I'm just sitting here in awe and in place of gratitude, because I mean, just having the privilege of meeting you and knowing what you've chosen to do. Now tell us what's next, because this has catapulted you into a new world, my friend, right? You're like, I'm moving on to the next project. We got another story in the works?
I should have started this stuff a long time ago. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to start talking to more people on airplanes, Holly.
See, we both learned a lesson, right?
Because some pretty great things come out of that. Aside from this incredible story that I was very privileged to tell, I also fell in love with the process of making a documentary film. As you had mentioned earlier at the top of the show, I had spent many years as just an old-fashioned print journalist. I never was involved in filmmaking. I love movies. I know you've got a family connection to the movies, and I love going to movies, but I was never part of that process at all. But I really fell in love with the process of storytelling through documentary film. And I knew after this first project that I wanted to find another documentary to make. And it's funny because the story of the 50 children is obviously comes out of the Holocaust. I never had any personal or professional connection to the Holocaust. And I have to say that after being immersed in that very dark world for a few years, I didn't initially think that I was going to want to do another Holocaust-related project. But during the course of the 50 children story, I met some folks, and particularly somebody who I was working with fairly closely at the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., and he happened to be doing some work with the Vatican. And we began to talk about the role that the Vatican and the Pope was playing and not playing during the years of World War II and the Holocaust. It remains a very controversial topic. And I began to sort of explore some angles into that story. So I'm now working on a documentary film that's going to take a look at the Vatican during the Holocaust. But I want to look specifically at the role that some relatively unknown Americans were playing sort of behind the scenes to try to influence the Pope at the time to kind of step up and do the right thing. So after all these years, I'm still sort of immersed in that tragic period of history, but again, trying to tell a story that I think is going to be kind of a new story to a lot of people seeing the film and getting them to think of that period in a somewhat different light. And that's the new project, and I'm now fully immersed in that project, and it's also a very inspiring story in a sense.
Good.
A little darker story than the story of the 50 children, because just because of the way history played itself out during that period. But I'm still looking for inspiring figures, and there certainly are some during that period who stepped up to do the right thing, and this is another film that will take a look at some of those people and shine a spotlight on what they did during that just very tragic period in modern history.
I can't wait. And I just need to ask, do we have a name for it yet? Do we have an estimated, at what point do you think you're going to be launching this, just so that the listeners, we can all hang on, right?
Sure. Well, the working title, and you know how these things work. The working title of the film is going to be Holy Secrets. The film is probably going to be ready about a year from now. I'm getting ready to show some excerpts at a conference in a couple of months. And so a little bit of the film will start dribbling out toward the end of this year. And then about a year from now, I'm hopeful that the film will be ready to be launched out there in the world. Very, very excited about it.
Oh, that's going to be here before we know it. And I have one favor to ask. All right. May Absolutely. I have the honor and privilege of having you on the show again as you get close to launch time, so we can support you and get ready to be a part of that whole exciting launch.
Oh, absolutely, Holly. And of course, the honor would be all mine. This is the kinds of messages that you're broadcasting out to the world are precisely the kinds of messages that we all desperately need these days. And it would be a privilege for me to continue this wonderful conversation with you.
Oh, I would love it. And if you ever need support on a set, I'm great. I mean, not only can I sit back, I can inspire everybody, right? I'll do that, of course, but I can always sit back and be a good grip hand or something, because I'm immersed and it's my passion, right? I mean, it's why we both were so connected. It's about stories of real people that are doing extraordinary things and bringing that to, I love that you use the shining the spotlight. It's a word and a vernacular I use a lot. If people like us aren't doing that, nobody gets to know these stories. And I always say, Steve, if one person, I'm going to think about that woman in Chicago. If one person's life is changed and impacted for the better, and they can have just a sparkle of light in their darkness, then that's why we did the show. That's why you did the movie. That's why you brought the story to life. And it's why I was so excited to celebrate you. And I have to say, okay, so as we wrap this up, I have one more thing I have to ask you. But it was just on my heart so much. Is it amazing the timing of 50 children and one of the movies that I watched not too long ago, finally watched it, and it was so close to me and so surreal, the closeness of these two, was The Zookeeper's Wife. Have you seen that?
I haven't seen the film. I read the book, and I loved the book, and I just haven't quite had a chance yet to see the movie. But the book is also, this is another fabulous, inspiring, true story of how one person or a couple people can make a huge difference. And I have to tell you, that was, to me, more than anything else, what was most meaningful about the 50 Children story, and it's true for great stories like The Zookeeper's Wife, is ultimately beyond everything else behind these stories, there's a reminder that ordinary people can always have the power, if they choose to use it, to do extraordinary things. Whether it's the wife of a zookeeper in Nazi Germany or Warsaw, Poland, or a husband and wife living in Philadelphia in relative comfort, where a half a world away, children and their parents are on the verge of being slaughtered. When those ordinary people step up to do extraordinary things, it's a reminder to us all these years later that we all have the power to do that. Very, very few of us ever exercise that power, but we all have the potential to do extraordinary things. And to me, more than anything else, that is the powerful reminder of these stories that still need to be told all these years later.
You just wrap this up with the most profound and beautiful. You know what that was for me? That was a charge. That was a challenge. That was a reminder that you're right. We all have the power to do it, but how few actually do, and what's stopping us, right? We let the fears get in the way, or all the reasons that what could happen. And these people inspire us because they didn't. They stuck to their soul and to their desire to make a difference. And you know what's funny, Steve? I usually end the show with asking my guests. I just think it's so funny. My final thing I was going to ask you is, what advice would you give your 25-year-old self if you were to go back and give that person advice on what you know today? And I think you kind of just gave it to us. You're like, right? Seriously.
I just sometimes wish I listened to my own words, because the easiest thing in the world is to tell somebody to rise above themselves, or to tell yourself to rise above yourself.
It's so true. Oh, thank you. Thank you, my new dear friend. Thank you for being here today. Thank you for the privilege and the honor of sharing what you're doing with the world. And I cannot wait to hear all about the next film. And I know the listeners will be too. And just thank you, and have an amazing rest of the week. And I look forward to staying in touch. Thank you for joining me for another awesome celebration of you. If you were inspired by this story, please share it with your family and friends, and hashtag Your Story Matters. I'd love to hear from you, so please leave a comment on iTunes. And absolutely, please come to my website, hollydowling.com. Leave a comment there too, and while you're there, pick up your free gift. Most importantly though, just remember that your life is a gift from God. What you do with it is your gift back.